Yeah, but
we're live, everybody, by the way, on Facebook. So welcome to Parallax. Welcome to Sweeny versus Bard, which is no longer really Sweeny versus Bard because it's always a trialogue right now. We love the number 3. And we're here to talk about crowds. The wisdom and the madness of crowds is our topic. And I hate crowds. I've always hated crowds, but maybe that's just me. I'm wondering where the wisdom of crowds are. I can understand that, like, all these uprisings happening in China and Russia, and then I could see crowds acting like, you know, like the QAnon Shannon and shaman and all. I could see crowds acting terribly and crowds acting perhaps risking their lives for various causes.
Wasn't the idea here? I love the title for tonight's conversation. The idea is that there's an old mathematical myth called crowds, and the idea is basically that if you ask 100 people about something they're supposed to guess, then the average answer you get is usually much better than the deviances from the norm. So, but it's just one of these many excuses we have in our culture for the fact that we have a market, a capitalist market, which is where some people are superior and some are inferior because some people are wealthy and some people are poor. And what we try to do with what I call democratism, this idea of democratism, is that we balance the fact that we are superior and inferior when it comes to wealth and poverty. We balance that with the idea that we go to vote every 4 years, and we put our vote into a booth, and then there's like one person, $1. So that would be like an equal thing. And there's this idea that we're equal, that we're equally valued in a society. And it's more like, this is where the idea of wisdom of crowds, I think, comes from in a modern context.
Mm-hmm. So what do you have to say about crowds, Thomas?
Well, dangerous stuff. I mean, I guess that we're going to bring in Girard tonight. I mean, Girard has a lot to say about mobs and crowds and so basically, I mean, that's one of the purposes of religion, right? It's to make crowds, mobs, manageable, and if they get crazy, if they go insane, they'd better go insane in the context of a proper ritual that is sanctioned by a religion. I think that's kind of the Girard in a nutshell, right?
Yeah, so this ties in nicely with the conversation we had before. For those who haven't followed previous conversations, they're all up online. And the three of us have had a wonderful time together exploring. First of all, we worked a lot with René Girard on the lynch mob, and later we started developing, so what could possibly be the opposite of the lynch mob? And I have, in my work with Jan Söderqvist, suggested that actually the history of the exoduses throughout history. So we methodology here. And that is, the exodus is an elite that forms itself in a certain cult to lead into a new age or to lead into a new territory. And they migrate, and they basically say, well, forget about Egypt. Here we're just slaves and underrated. Actually, we should be more appreciated because we're more powerful. And we get a leader. We have a leadership, and we have a vision of where we're going, and this phallic vision is somewhere where we want to go. And we've explored this idea that the intelligent crowd is actually a well-led crowd that has a vision that it implements throughout history. And we call this the Exodus. And I would say that we proposed before is that the Exodus can be worked with as the opposite of the lynch mob. Yeah. And then we've added to that Nietzsche's fantastic division between the Apollonian and the Dionysian made it even more complex.
Yeah. Well, the Exodus, the original Exodus is a people, right? Going out of Israel. So what kind of people, what would the Exodus?
No. You know, Exodus Exodus means exit. It means we're leaving. We're getting out. So we have Genesis in the Bible. That's the birth of something. So birth of humanity, birth of nature, or whatever, a birth of civilization, hopefully. And then you have an Exodus. And today an Exodus would be, for example, we have had an industrialist, capitalist society. We're moving on to a much more complex digital attentionalist society. Some people get this. Some people have a natural talent to take to new ideas. They absorb it quicker. Some people are just fortunate enough to be in parts of the world where the Wi-Fi is more powerful, or they speak the language that makes they can communicate with more people or whatever. But what we're seeing today is an exodus to digital. And what we're suggesting here is that instead of trying to get everybody on board, which is a more of, really lynch mobbish kind of attitude, we have to have some people who walk first, and they probably do it as a group. And that's an exodus. And they can then, if you use Gerard here, they can then be role models, because the only thing human beings can do, as Thomas often points out, is that they can basically mimic. But if they have nothing to mimic, they're lost. And that's when we get the lynch mobs in history. So
let's describe the Red Sea. What's the Red Sea? I mean, we're using this metaphor of the Exodus, and what's on the other side? Like, what's the Promised Land? What's you saying it's digital, and what does that mean?
What's important with the Red Sea, if we take this original biblical story, which is brilliant, by the way, if you take this story, we got Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, the three siblings, and they represent the three different powers in Shakla Khan, which is imaginary power, symbolic power, and real power, right? So they lead. Apparently, so that's what this is, a story of three siblings. But the Red Sea represents, you walk out, you leave, you're gone, and there's no way back. But the Red Sea that represents is that the thing you're leaving will suddenly try to catch up with you. It will become a lynch mob. And this represents the Pharaoh of Egypt, who then decides that, no, I cannot let the Hebrews go. They are the future. They are the only people who understand that, for example, monotheism is the way forward, whereas polytheism will only make Egypt decadent and destroyed. And that's understandable. It's probably also what happened. And then the old goes after the new. This is what we call woke today.
Yeah. And it seems like there's a lot of gods, right, in the Egyptian culture, like millions of gods, and somehow they all have to be destroyed and one god has to survive. And, that's what monotheism is in a sense. It's like the destruction of all the old pagan gods or something like that.
Yeah, no, really, but I'd love to have Thomas' take on that. Why is there monotheism rather than polytheism? Because they actually operate in parallel. Yeah. This idea that we were first polytheist and then become monotheist is a terrible Christian myth that's not true at all. Actually, monotheism and polytheism always exist in parallel.
Yeah, and well, I wanted to question that actually. So
polytheism is the folk religion. That's what people do when they worship idols. Yeah. Gerard agrees, is when they worship idols. At best, they worship icons. At worst, they worship idols. But the idols and icons out that the people worship all the time, rock stars or whatever they follow, and they follow blindly, more or less. That's what they do. There are false phalluses, which are terrible leaders to follow, and there are authentic phalluses that actually want to take you somewhere else, somewhere better. And this is how people guard themselves. But then also there's monotheism, which is practiced either by the priest or the military. And that is, we're looking at the world, but it's prioritizing the overall goal. And the reason why you go monotheist before you conduct the Exodus is that you must go somewhere. There must be one point you go towards. And the Promised Land, for example, the biblical Exodus. So God is just the name of the Promised Land. Then that God has to be divided between the priest and the military function, between the chief and the priest.
Okay, that's the map. That's the Bardian map there, right there. Yeah.
It's a very philosophical God.
What do you mean by that? What are you trying to say?
I often think I think of religion as something you do, right? I mean, you can do it with one God or with a lot of idols, but the basic thing is that you need to have some kind of liturgy and you need to have some kind of framework so you can talk about things like God and purpose and meaning and morality and all of that stuff. So I'm kind of like less and less. I think it's great when philosophers discuss God, like for example Whitehead did, because that also makes it possible to kind of engage with this idea for people who have been thinking for a very long time that the concept of God is nonsense, which it isn't. I mean, you can write perfectly nice philosophy around it, but at the end of the day, religion needs to be something you do. Otherwise, otherwise, what is it good for, right? I mean, it's not, if you just need a system of thought, then you can turn to politics, or you can turn to philosophy, or you can turn to mathematics or science. But religion it should offer you a liturgy and a community.
Well, when we're talking about the Promised Land, we're already in the realm of metaphor, right? We're not in the realm.
No. You're two different levels, Sandro. The monotheism that was practiced by the Jews and practiced by Zoroastrians was a monotheism of the priest. It was really a philosophical exercise. It was much closer to Hegel than anything else. But the God, you cannot worship that God in your own everyday life. Yeah. Say you're a certain type of man or a certain type of woman, you have a certain type of family. You might belong to a certain caste, to be honest about it. That's how you used to organize a society. That means each has its own gods. And these are called the lesser gods in theology. And I'm a total defender of polytheism operating parallel monotheism. And Catholicism was the response to that. They finally accepted that, oh, if you're going to be a massive religion and we're going to adopt the entire Roman Empire, which was built on polytheism, the only way to do it is to say that there's more to Christ. Well, philosophically speaking, there's more to Christ because you divide chief and priest, and that becomes father and son. You can then add spirit, which is, of course, the congregation, and then invite people to make their own exodus, their own journey throughout their life to be a divine congregation. This is literally what Christ is supposed to have said before he leaves his community. He says, whenever the two of you are together, I'm there with you. That is the spirit. And then, of course, in popular religion, that didn't make much sense. That was kind of weird. So people and put her there. And then they got the Moses, Aaron, and Miriam triad from Judaism. And in Christianity, that became father, son, mother. And for the vast majority of Christians, that makes a lot more sense. Orthodox Christianity, they started worshiping Virgin Mary as a saint. Now, if you have one saint, you might as well have tons of them. And it turns out it was a wonderful construct for Catholicism and a winning formula for Christian Orthodoxy to have all these saints appointed who could actually talk to, so that they could talk to God on their behalf.
Yeah. Well, there's also like a triad in the Hindu tradition where, you know, you could either become realized by study, like intellectual work, or you could become realized by like physical work, like you would work the land, or you would, you know, that was called karma yoga. And then the last one would be devotional, like where the more emotional kind of thing, which I think is closer to the polytheistic model, where it's just a sort of, you know, emotionalism all the time. So all those three, you know, in Vajrayana, the tradition I study, and all those three are used, and it's supposed to be a conglomeration of all three. So part
in psychoanalysis, we invent an imaginary order of the world. On top of that, add language, and through that we have a symbolic order of the world. And Moses represents the symbolic order clearly in Judaism. Aaron represents the imaginary order, and the real power here, that's the sister, that's Miriam, to whom the two brothers and the entire people are responsible. And it was also the last station out. She's the person, if you're behind, like that's always matriarchal power resides there. So this is in Lacan, this is psychoanalysis. So it makes sense for us. It's how our psyche operates. But in everyday life, like Thomas pointed out, like if to make your life meaningful, to give meaning to your everyday activities, the most mundane, boring things you do in life, you get appreciation from the lesser gods for doing that. And that's your God. It's usually the profession that has a God, or the city has a God. Any of these subcultures that we create today online, that are the new tribalism today, they're going to work as the sort of embodied tribes that Thomas talks about. They need gods. They need idols. They need guys who've done this before and done it successfully that you can mimic.
And I would also add that the practices are kind of weird in Vajrayana. Like you make water offerings and smoke offerings and visualize strange goddesses, and they're completely phenomenological, right? And they're nothing, you know, part of it is not intellectual whatsoever, right? And then part of it is this very, very intense study of the mind, you know? So.
I agree completely. I think that's what Thomas pointed out. This is deeply immersed in ritual. That's what we've lost in our culture. And we're in a very dangerous apocalyptic position at the moment, because that hole will be filled by whoever provides us with any kind of rituals.
Any kind of rituals, yeah.
There's no end to the sects and cults that will develop over the next 30 years.
Right.
Absolutely manic. We're going to see New Age fascism rise next in America. Undoubtedly so. Yeah. That's how mad things are getting. And this is why we're talking about the madness of crowds. Douglas Murray wrote a really good pop version of this, but let's go deeper on what do we really mean with the madness of crowds here? I mean, why is it so terrible?
Well, let's look at the thing that happened in the US and the QAnon Shannon with his horns and his spear and his like pagan attire storming the US. You know, what's going on there?
No, that's over and done with. That's been commented on so much. Andrew, everybody's commented on that. Well, I think what's beneath that, what's going to come next.
What's going to come next then? Okay.
What's going to come next is what it's increasingly called New Age fascism. And I think it's with the male psyche, goes as crazy as the New Age psyche goes with women. But when women go for crystal healing and astrology, men are increasingly going for more and more desperate and weirder conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
And this time around, they're going to see themselves as actors within those conspiracy theories, or as actors who prevent these conspiracies from happening.
I wonder if Girard has some insight on conspiracy theories. Thomas, do you have any thoughts about that? Like the conspiracy theory must have something to do with the scapegoat. I mean,
yeah, I mean, yes, of course, from that point of view, I mean, it's basically just a story that you use to justify unifying the tribe around the scapegoat, right? I mean, that's what people that's I mean, we've talked about this a lot, right? I mean, that's the default religion. If you take people's religion away, if you don't offer them a religion that is somehow a bit refined, then they revert to the default religion. And that is basically, let's make a story, let's find a scapegoat, and let's unite ourselves around the scapegoat, right? Which is what Kristeva called the abject, right? The thing that you hate and you unite around hatred. That's the default religion.
Default religion, that's a good term.
We are moving back to default religion at breathtaking speed. That's the underlying structure of what's going on, right? You know, people are now discussing Trump and QAnon and what have you, but the problem lies deeper, right? I mean, the internet we have connected everybody through the internet, and that means that everybody's competing with everybody, and that leads to this typical Girardian escalation, right? Because normally societies are stratified, and they're stratified using religion. And that is because you want to avoid that everybody's connected with everybody and that everybody competes with everybody, because then you get rivalry. When you get rivalry, you get conflict. When you get conflict, then you get scapegoating, you get conspiracy stories, and then you get the killing of the scapegoat, right? And, you know, typically that's, traditionally in the West, that's the Jews, right? I mean, in the Second World War. And I mean, the funny thing is, if you look at the main villains of Me Too, right? That's, these are, who are these guys? The two main villains of Me Too. That's
rich Jewish men. I don't know.
Epstein and Weinstein, right?
Yeah.
They're rich Jewish men who have been having sex with white women. I mean, I'm not saying they're innocent or anything like that, but I mean, it's kind of striking. It's kind of like a stereotype, right? We have like deeply ingrained patterns of finding scapegoats, and we really like indulging in them.
Yeah. Well, I think anti-Semitism is a sort of like, it is kind of one of the fallback religions that you're talking about, right?
Yes.
It's one of the, it's like an archetype which takes over people, right? And it's the fallback thing, right? When you need a scapegoat.
It is because we never dealt with the opposition between Christianity and Judaism in the first place.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
We sort of swept it under the carpet. The Jews tried to remind us of it. We sweep it under the carpet all over again. And then basically those functions in society that are the most powerful to be run by Jews. No wonder they became a superior upper class in Western society. And then they become even better as scapegoats. So that's exactly what happened, as we know, in Germany in the 1930s. It's happened over and over again. It's about to happen now as well. I think Jews are terrified of what's going on in America.
Yeah. Well, you were saying before we had this conversation, you were talking about the storming of the Reichs and all that, and you think all that sort of thing is going to happen again, or you know?
Are you kidding? I mean, this is just the beginning. The thing, though, is
because it seems kind of caricature-like the thing.
I talked to Jamie Wheel about it today, if I don't mind name dropping Jamie, because he's brilliant. But I talked to Jamie Wheel about it in the private conversation, and the thing is that these guys don't even need politics. That's what people are underrating it. They're overrating politics immensely. People are overrating politics. They're overrating the power of academia, and they're overrating mass media massively at the moment. Thaddeus Russell and I discussed this too. These old institutions are overrated because these old institutions still assume they have some kind of a powerful position for which they can preach the rules. Okay?
Yeah.
Politics is getting smaller every day. We are undoubtedly moving towards a police state run by AI most of the time with administrators. And increasingly, we were looking at these administrators as the better option compared to the politicians. You know, at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, politicians seemed reasonable, but then we realized they were just mimicking Chinese dictators more than anything else and didn't know what they were doing. And by the time you get to the second or the third wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, you realize these politicians have no clue what they're doing at all. They only try to act like if they're tough, but they're like 5-year-olds to try to behave as if they were somehow smart grown-ups who know what they were doing. And they're competing in the toughness thing. And of course, people are reacting against this, again, because there's nothing but false fellows there. There's no leadership. Nobody's in control. Nobody knows what's going on. So we're going to see all of Europe explode this spring, mark my words, and we're going to see increasingly massive crowds, lynch mobs on the streets, and they're going to try to find scapegoats to blame the fact on that this is going out of control. People don't even know what the problem is any longer. Is it the pandemic? Is it the virus? Is it the mutation? Is it the vaccination? Is it the lockdown? Is it the isolation? Is it just my mind going bonkers because nobody gets this and there is no plan to anything? When it's becoming absolutely obvious, there's not even a conspiracy here.
There's no conspiracy, but there's a kind of agreement. Everybody has, there's this kind of tacit agreement between people that, oh yeah, we have to have a lockdown or.
No, there's not. It's gone.
Yeah.
It's gone completely. You don't realize what's going on in the streets.
What I just mean is like the lockdown itself is
no
kind of
anymore. Germany and Holland are tonight, as we're talking about this, blowing up in the streets.
Okay. Well.
The politicians have no idea what they're doing, but they're overplaying their card. They think politics is so important that we would pay respect to politicians that think they're important. Mass media thinks the same thing. We're all in social media now. And social media, and then when the old institutions, politics and academia, terrified of social media, they try to moralize against it. And big tech played a game they could never win. They played the game that they thought balanced the different sides in this conflict. But the sides are so many. And it's so hard to balance this that big tech finally, whoop, swept over, depending on what political color the diversity officers happened to have at the big tech companies in Silicon Valley a month ago, swept to the left and became Democrats in America. The Republicans hate them for it, and now it's war. Now it's social media war, and it's really about the platforms themselves.
It's social
media. You're going to see
war.
the Republicans tear. They're going to tear big tech apart.
And that is going to spill out onto the streets with crowds and all that.
Of course it will. And Republicans have nothing to lose. They don't have Congress. They don't have the White House. They're the perfect opposition party. And the perfect scapegoat for them to run their lynch mob happens to be Mark Zuckerberg. That's what's going to happen. This is Girardian on a massive scale, right?
Girardian on a massive scale, yeah.
Yes. It's fascinating to see how predictable this is.
Do you want to pick up on any of that, Thomas?
Well, yeah, I think that these are very good points. I mean, we'll see what happens, right? I mean, but what I think is that so often the discussion that I hear is at a very superficial level. You know, if we wouldn't have Trump, then things would be better and stuff like that. It's like people don't understand that we are being swept away by technological changes, and that we are being confronted with very, very deeply ingrained patterns of human behavior. And it seems that nobody. I would recommend every politician to study Girard deeply.
And McLuhan. I mean, what you're saying makes me think of McLuhan here, actually.
McLuhan, absolutely. McLuhan is. I think McLuhan and Girard are kind of the two thinkers you need to study like really, really deeply today.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's it. And then you can have an intelligent discussion about the underlying patterns of why people behave the way they do, why technology has this effect. And then you step away from just this.
Yeah, because Clune was always saying, just ignore the content, ignore the noise, or ignore whatever everybody's saying, because it's all bullshit pretty much. It's the technological thing that's happening and how it's affecting us that is
it is very much
the medium that is.
It's very much. If you take a third guy here, Lacan, who we also love, and take all three together, but what is the real in Lacan is actually kind of a body. Like it's the body here, and that's the realness here lies in both the technologies, the fact that we think independently, all of the technologies we use, and the way they operate actually dictates how we think. So this is like. I've been working with Söderqvist for this for 30 years. It's definitely Marshall McLuhan. But the interesting thing with McLuhan here and Girard is that they both point to what Lacan says, that we've lived in a certain symbolic order, and we've added a certain imaginary order on top of that. That's what a paradigm is. When I talk about the industrialist capitalist society, we talk about a word like democracy, like it's something sacred. know what democracy is, and it must never be moved or changed or whatever because democracy is holy all the time. When we talk about these things, what comes back now to haunt us is the real. And the real comes back from two places, precisely like Thomas has pointed out. The two things we have ignored is the real of technology and the real of our own bodies. It is our own bodies, our pathos, the logos, not the mythos. It is the pathos that comes back in a big way. It's like we're
and that's McLuhan too, because McLuhan's always talking about disembodiment. He's always talking about how the media is making us disembodied.
No. There's certain medias do, certain medias do not. You must not say, McLuhan does not have a general rule for media. McLuhan says that each medium can be cold or hot or whatever.
Cold or hot medium,
He's always open to the idea that a new media can come along and operate completely differently from any of the past. That's why I use, in my work with Söderqvist, I use McLuhan a lot to understand emergence vector theory, because as soon as you understand that history is these different things that develop over time and suddenly an emergence happens and everything changes, then as soon as you talk about that, people will try to find, okay, so what is an emergence then? And it's like, well, you cannot have general emergence theory. That's exactly the point. An emergence is so dramatic that it changes the very conditions for what an emergence can be. This is what we need Hegel for.
Yeah, I should clarify there, because
same thing. There is no general media theory in McLuhan. We must point that out.
Well, McLuhan was talking about hot media, so he was talking about the media that's all consuming, which is not what we're doing here. This is cold media because we can really participate in it in some sense, but hot media is this, the kind of media that just overwhelms you and
but
feels all your senses, and that's the disembodying type of media.
Yeah, you and I've talked to Clinton, and I told we highly recommend to check out the conversation with Clinton, the threesome we have with him. We talk a lot about McLuhan. But the point here, McLuhan is really Hegelian in the sense that, and like Whitehead is too, it's like, if something genuinely new happens in history, which it does in an open world, open contingent society, universe like ours, right? If that happens, that means it also changes the rules of what you just talked about. So you cannot say McLuhan has forever decided that media operates a certain way, the different media. There can be a new media that operates entirely differently. That's why McLuhan, even in his last text in the 1990s, he grasped what digital would be. He's a very good read. But there are also details we're now discovering by digital that he did not get in the late 1990s. That should be pointed out. And he also told us repeatedly, I'm not going to get the full picture of something that hasn't even happened yet. But by understanding...
Well, he said he wanted to study the present. Like he didn't want to study the future or the past. He said, most people study the future or the past. I want to study the present.
But that's completely misunderstood. So that's a bad one-liner in this case, although it's correct. Because actually what we're saying here, and McLuhan would agree, is that go to Girard and McLuhan himself and Malkan. These guys will talk about one of two things or both. They will talk about either history itself, who are we as historical beings?
Yeah.
What is our genetic makeup? What is a human being to begin with? What are we? How will we react, to anything in a sort of more timeless sense? And then the time specific, which is the media environment we're in, which we need desperately to understand what's going on right now.
Yeah.
For example, how is 2021 1789?
It's different than 1789.
And how is it comparable to 1789? You will discover that the comparable thing with 1789 is very much grounded in Lacan and Girard. And what is different in 2021 is precisely what McLuhan adds to that. So he talks about the different paradigm, whereas Lacan and Girard says, yeah, this has happened before, it's happening again, and this is how it works.
Yeah.
And they do it better than anybody else out there.
Tom, why do you think that McLuhan and Girard are Catholics? Like, why you study theology and stuff? Why are these two, radical, kind of very radical thinkers, traditional Catholics? Like, what's going on with the Catholics?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think maybe one of the explanations is because it's totally not done these days.
Yeah,
because it's not cool. And that gives you a lot of freedom. So you can finally kind of look at this religion and 2,000 years of history without any authority breathing down your neck and kind of making it your own. That might be one of the answers. I mean, why would you? I mean, you wouldn't become it wouldn't be very appealing if it was kind of like the religion of a certain, let's say, if it was a religion of authority and power. But it isn't like that anymore. And that kind of makes it interesting. And I think it's also because it has so much good liturgy. It has so much good music. It has scripture. It has practices that are close to home. You don't have to, learn how to read Sanskrit or Tibetan, the Tibetan language or something like that. So it's understandable. I think that these are.
And Alexander would say it kind of introduces the polytheistic aspect.
No, I will go in further. I would provocatively say that it took this long for the Counter-Reformation to happen, because while Lacan and Girard see the things they do as very literate French Catholics, is that they see that Protestantism took off in Northern Europe and then became the default state religion of North America, and it is the religion of industrialism and capitalism.
Yeah.
And industrialism and capitalism will, as a Protestant world, understand itself as a world of men of ideas, that entrepreneurs and they engineer things, and they will then exploit the world, and they will build big stuff, and they build skyscrapers in New York eventually. Like that's the idea. That's like a Protestant dream. And it turned out to be correct. But now, when that is falling apart, you cannot go back to Protestantism to find a critique that works. Not even to Calvinism, which is another form of Protestantism, which is even more American in a way. You have to go all the way back to Catholicism. Catholicism has tried to understand human beings for so much longer. And in that, correctly, Andrew, you pointed out, is included the idea that polytheism and the lesser gods have to be part of human beings' worldview, because otherwise you leave that part, the most important part of religion in everyday life. If you leave polytheism to the secular market forces, you get Hollywood. Rock stars are going to kill themselves when they're 25.
But you get Nazi Germany. I mean, don't forget that Nazi Germany emerged in a Protestant environment, right?
Right.
It did,
interesting. Yeah. Well, but
it did develop out of Bavaria, and so it's more complex than that. I think it developed out of a sort of very infantile, vulgarized Nietzschean fantasy of nationalism. And that's where it came from. And interesting enough, you go deep into Nazism, it is Jew envy from the very beginning. This is the idea of Germany becoming both the Persian and Jewish nation at the same time. And the way to do that is, of course, eugenics on top of that. And to be honest about it, in the 1920s, eugenics was the shit. Everybody was doing it. Catholics were doing it. Protestants were doing it. They were all doing it. They were not immunized against eugenics at all. It was an incredibly popular idea in the 1920s. This is the vulgarized version of Darwin. We vulgarized Darwin, vulgarized Nietzsche, and got Hitler in response to that. And that's what we read Darwin and Nietzsche, who are geniuses, but we need to read. So it's more a fantasy of a nationalism that has cut off Christianity entirely, I would say, to go pagan.
Yeah, Carl Jung would say that the Catholic tradition needed sort of individualism of Protestantism to balance its authoritarianism, and so the two had to kind of work side by side or something.
It should be pointed out that it wasn't the Catholics who opposed Adolf Hitler in Germany. The entire German elite who did oppose Hitler and fought and sacrificed their own lives were evangelical Christians, all Protestants. So it was actually the Protestants understood that Hitler was probably the biggest enemy Christianity could ever have.
And the Catholics were more likely to embrace
it was Lutheran Protestants.
Well, actually, the Protestants in Nazi Germany, many of them wanted to collaborate with the Nazis and send chaplains to the front and stuff like that. But Hitler wasn't very fond of it, because he wasn't very fond of Christianity. But in the First World War, there was a major blend of nationalism and Protestantism, and this war, the First World War, was completely backed up by mainstream Christianity in Germany.
That's correct.
Yeah,
I want to bring this conversation to something I'm really fascinated with and I've worked on lately, and it is a comparative study with Girard and another one of my favorites, which I think is Hegel, or the understanding of Hegel we have today. And it has to do with the idea that the sort of boring dyad from Kant, from Immanuel Kant, of the subject object and the subject constructing the phenomenon that never be reached in itself because there's a ding on cis we can never reach. You all know probably Kant by now. But with Hegel, only a few years after Kant actually comes to turn against Kant. And Hegel basically says that opposition is ridiculous because it assumes that the world is fixed in a Platonist way. And Hegel said, well, he was like, the way Aristotle opposed Plato, he did the same turn against Kant. So he said that, no, this is ridiculous. There has to be process involved in all of this. And I think the proper word today for subject versus object versus the third theme here that Byung-Chul Han has suggested, the Korean philosopher, is project. So say you got a project that unites different subjects. If you think of subjects as tribal creatures, and we're social creatures. So there's a bunch of people. They get together, and by having a shared project which unites them, they can then be split into different subjects.
Yeah.
They can then relate to an object, which is basically, again, we talked about God, the promised land before. The object is merely the name of somewhere where we're going for a direction. So say the end goal of this project. And this is at least how men work. If you look at a hunting team or, a bunch of guys who work on a project together and they're going to build a building or whatever, they would definitely see themselves as a project unite. And it makes it a lot easier for them to have a beer afterwards, to sleep with each other's wives, and moving to the same village and create a community because they have a shared project. Now, that is very Hegelian, right? Now, but Girard, though, he uses the word model, doesn't he, Thomas?
Yes. Yep. So you have.
So why don't you give us a take on the Girardian triad here that he uses against the Kantian dyad, which is always
So desire is a triad, and that means that even though it feels like that it's like it's me who wanted that. That's actually not the case. It's actually so that you first kind of connect to a model, and that model wants something, and because that model wants something, you will want it too. So there's always three. There's a subject, there's a model, and there's an object. So the classic example is, for example, that you have a good friend. Your friend gets interested in a woman, and you get interested in her as well. So and Dostoevsky and a lot of other writers have really explored this topic very deeply. And according to Girard, that is actually how our desire is structured. There's always three. There's always a model, a subject, and an object. So you basically pick up your desires from those around you. So it's very infectious.
So how do we connect this to what Alexander is saying about the project? I'm not quite.
Well, I think this kind of so what Girard kind of says is that so you can have you have a horizontal mimesis and vertical mimesis. So if you do horizontal mimesis, then you're basically picking up the object of desire from those around you, and that means that you will go into conflict with people, because you will actually go into conflict with those that you admire and respect the most, because you pick up the objects of desire from those you respect the most, from those that your friends, right? But because you go for the same objects, you become rivals to each other. So that's what humans do. So they constantly turn each other into rivals. So
I think it's absolutely correct. The Hegelian project thing here comes in how you try to organize this, because Hegel, like myself, is a social philosopher. And that's why Girard is much closer to psychoanalysis. You understand how this actually operates in your mind, right? So the difference is, what is the vertical mimesis versus horizontal mimesis? Because horizontal mimesis, you look to the guy next to you and you envy what he gets and you want the same thing. So where would vertical mimesis be in this? Would that be closer to the project? Because the project is what the leader installs. So the leader says that he knows that you're all going to mimic each other, become rivals, and then kill each other and become a lynch mob if nobody leads you. Okay, but if I take leadership here, it's not me as a person who's the leader. It's that I formulate the project, and we're going to go to the promised land. It might take long to get there, but that gives meaning to absolutely everything else we do. It's like we cast away the line over there, boop, and then it got stuck at that, and then we sort of pull ourselves in that direction. That's how a project works. And then you pull everybody for like 40 years through the desert or whatever, but everything else along the time when you do that is given meaning and purpose, because there is a direction to everything you do, which of course we're totally lacking in contemporary society. That's why we're terrified of having lynch mobs everywhere. So the vertical mimesis, how would that fit in here, Thomas?
Well, I think it's closely related. I mean, Girard, of course, would say like you basically make sure that you align yourself with a religion that makes sure that you don't go into these destructive mimetic cycles. So that would be, but that you can reformulate that as a certain project, right? But then I would like to I have a question for you, Alexander. So we're now actually very close to what Kierkegaard and Heidegger are talking about, like, right? Because what Kierkegaard says, like, well, you need to do this vertical mimesis, this project. You need that by going back to Christianity and making Christianity work for you in an authentic way. So that's Kierkegaard, right? A Christian apologetic. Heidegger says you need to have a commitment. You need to have a goal, something that's bigger than you, and you need to align yourself to it. Now, these are kind of very dangerous things to do, right? I mean, you can look at Heidegger. He thought like, oh, look at these Nazis. That's a great project. I mean, he just basically became kind of a quite convinced Nazi, right? So all this commitment and projects and stuff like that, and alignment to a religion, that's all great and good. But how do you avoid aligning yourself with obviously destructive projects?
Okay, the way I lined out in Digital Libido with Söderqvist was that we made a great work on authentic phallus versus fake phallus. And we have reasons to do this division because I'm a Zoroastrian, at least I think Jan is too. And in Zoroastrianism, you have two principles called Osha and Andrew. And this beats the shit out of Kierkegaard and Heidegger. Because what is more important in Zoroastrianism is to get up in the morning and do a meditation, which, by the way, is very similar to Buddhist and Taoist meditation traditions. They're essentially the same. So you go up and do a Tushamashtu in the morning, which is like you cleanse your mind. And then you think, okay, I got the day ahead of me. And you even have a little shirt. I don't have it on because it's kind of a sacred thing to wear. You have a little shirt on with a little pocket at your heart. And you sort of think like you're going to put possible good thoughts that day and possible good acts that day, words, into that little pocket and identify with them. Like if you are this person, like you're almost pre-programmed to go to do those things during the day. And of course, you will then not avoid doing the things you have to do. You will take pride in doing the things you have to do that day first, and then maybe you can entertain yourself after that. But it creates a good work day in any culture, whether you're a farmer or you're a trader or whatever you are. It makes sense. It's understandable that this tradition is 4,000 years old. It makes sense, right? Mm-hmm. You do that every day, Asha. And actually, that is a very good ethical principle in general. The opposite principle is druj. And what you do as a Zoroastrian is that you don't have any commandments. You don't need those. This is a very simple principle that works on every level. You don't need commandments because the rest of the commandments in the Bible start to make sense once you figure this out. Druj is when you're lazy, self-absorbed, self-obsessed, or something like that. You get up in the morning, ignore your meditation, and you start having this sort of bitter, resentful attitude towards life. It's a very sort of everyday form of Nietzscheanism, to be honest about it. That's the way I see it. Now, Osha versus Drew can then be taken actually to a much larger picture. It's just like, what kind of leader is this? So there's a very attractive leader to step to the forefront. And this is where we have done the work. We've split these two guys. We've taken what I call the Osha here into the hyperject, and we've taken the false phallus or the Druj attitude, the anoject. And please realize here, the anoject is a lazy guy. It's laziness.
Can you explain the hyperject a little bit? I think I understand the anoject.
Okay,
I'm not quite sure about the hyperject.
So, okay, what happens is that when the lynch mob is disorganized and doesn't have anywhere to go, which is a pagan lynch mob essentially, right? When that happens, what will happen is that people will assume that there's a shared opinion within the lynch mob. It's taken for granted very quickly. You can see this with Me Too and Black Matter. It's just like people went after people that had the wrong tonality, the wrong etiquette. They just uttered the wrong word and they were killed, right? Yeah. That's all it took. Now, where does this shared opinion come from? It starts to happen very quickly, kind of weird.
It's based on resentment, right?
Yeah, but what's important here is that it's shared and it's very clear.
Shared resentment.
Yeah, it's a shared resentment that is symbolic. It's verbalized. I haven't seen Lacan go here before. I haven't seen, the only philosopher I can think of who's been here before is actually Hannah Arendt in a really important work after Nazism.
Well, I hate to say that, but Jordan Peterson's kind of back. And he's always talking about resentment being, this is
no,
not
this is
nothing.
Saying, no, sorry, okay. Jordan is not in this league. Sorry, he's never been clothed on objectivity.
Right.
No.
All right.
Go back
he is talking about.
Shut up, Andrew. Honor Hannah Arendt. Bend down on her knees.
Yeah, I love Hannah.
Important female philosophers ever. She also happened to be a Jewish lover to Martin Heidegger, speaking of perversions here. But she left for America. Simon Critchley has her chair. Last thing I heard at New School in New York. We honor Simon for that. She was a fantastic philosopher, and she was one of the few people who actually dealt with the Holocaust afterwards and wrote some fantastic books in the 1950s and 60s. And she even defended Heidegger when people went after him, although I think, like Thomas probably pointed out, Heidegger was bound to be a Nazi. His entire ideology pointed towards it. The blind obedience to any leader is very Kantian, actually, in Heideggerian, and it leads to Nazism eventually. But Hannah Arendt looks into this, and it's possibly her, but I would claim that Söderqvist and I, and we in our work here, I honor you guys, have invented the term anoject. We need a word for this. Please note that ano is anonymous. So anoject is like a being that is anonymous because he doesn't want to take on a costume. He doesn't want to be held responsible for anything he says or do. But suddenly, at the right moment, a guy who puts on a certain costume and just says exactly the anojective vocabulary, speaks it out loudly, exactly what Adolf Hitler did, especially in the early 1930s, which is also why he rose to power so quickly and became so infinitely popular. This is a case against democracy, if anyone. The most popular politician ever measured in the opinion poll was Adolf Hitler in Germany in 1938, when 95% of Germans supported him as chancellor.
Yeah.
And the only people who were against it basically were the Jews. That's all, right? That's how bad Germany was in 1938. And he was an anoject. And this is the false phallus par excellence. Joseph Stalin and Hitler, we sort of deconstruct them into the Libido. So these are false phalluses, and that's been obvious. But this is why there are false phalluses. Now, the hyperject, which you're working on in the new book.
Is the hyperject also the Messiah or
not yet.
Savior?
No, wait. The anoject becomes the tyrant when he puts on the costume. You got to be very careful not to say the tyrant and anoject are the same thing. The anoject is what Deleuze calls a precursor to the tyrant. The anoject can be we didn't have a tyrant at Me Too, but the anoject was certainly there. And we could have had that leader. And Black Lives Matter didn't get that one leader who led Black Lives Matter. We don't know what's going to happen after Trump with the new age fascism in America that, by the way, he's not responsible for, but opened up the door for. So, but once that guy steps in, he tends to be a very Hitler-like figure. And we've seen these figures throughout history, the tyrants of history. But the opposite of that, and this is where it gets hard, the opposite of that is the hyperject. And the only thing we know about the hyperject, this is a guy who's just born to stand up against the lynch mob and say, fuck you, you stupid crowd of madness.
Yeah.
You can kill me, you can make me a scapegoat, I don't care. He's called the savior in Western culture. He's called the Messiah in Judaism. He's called originally the Osha in Zoroastrianism. And he was invented in Persia. There are no equivalents in Eastern culture, but he was invented in Persia. And he became part of Western culture because we tend to believe in the event more than we believe in the process. And with the shift from a religion of process and eternal return of the same towards a religion of the event that can change things forever, that goes all the way from Zoroastrianism up to Nietzsche, all the ways eventological. There comes the hyperject. And
the hyperject's the hero in some sense, No,
if the hyperject gets a costume, he becomes the savior. Okay. So the savior is opposed to the tyrant, and the hyperject as precursor to savior is opposed to anoject's precursor.
It's a precursor.
So you have to have all four in a quadrant to understand it.
But so you have these precursors, and that's kind of like that's what's lifting up and then there's the full manifestation.
This work is not in Girard because Girard goes deep into anthropology and psychoanalysis, bless him. But this is where we need to take Girard next, I think, into the world of social philosophy. This is why I'm interested in the comparative study between Hegel and Girard. I think it's incredibly fruitful because Hegel would also have been obsessed with Kierkegaard and Heidegger and found them incredibly self-important, narcissistic, full of themselves. And this is always my critique of people who take existentialism to be a personal journey. I don't think it is at all. I think a person who goes into existentialism as a personal journey, which is the problem I have with Heidegger, I've even had that problem with Jan Söderqvist, is that these guys become material for tyrants. They haven't realized that their subjectivity is originally a tribal thing. It starts with project, or it starts with model, and then it becomes subjectivity. It must go.
So it's kind of the lonely individual aspect of Kierkegaard and or the authenticity of Heidegger. What's the problem with that?
The problem with both Kierkegaard and Heidegger is, I would say, that they didn't really, they wanted to make the turn of being an individual in front that is against a mob, but they both failed at this.
Yeah.
Because
that's why they need to be. That's why Kierkegaard is so ironic.
You have to believe in Christianity because it is absurd. That's the reason that you have to believe in it. I mean, that's kind of like, that's already kind of like, it's like longing for submission without examination to start with. And Heidegger has the same attitude, right? Find this big movement, the big Bewegung. And really throw yourself in there, and that's not really. I think
they are ironic. This is
ironic.
Case.
Exactly the word.
Okay, so ironic. The way we would frame it today, since your beloved Jordan Peterson's back in full form, Andrew, and I love Jordan too, but Jordan has a massive problem ahead of him. He has never been anything but an ironic Christian, exactly like Kierkegaard.
Yeah,
he hasn't stayed true to
that's
the
his
Nietzsche.
Weakness. I agree with that.
He should be a Nietzschean, but he's not. He's not a Nietzschean. He is a Kierkegaardian. Even Slavoj Žižek ends up here too. Yeah. Heidegger ends up here too. Certainly, but Heidegger is an ironic pagan.
Yeah,
it's irony. You cannot say that we must go back to this, no matter how absurd it is. No, you got to go back to how it was built originally and why it was built the way it was. And you got to go through that entire process and understand it. And
that's a lot of work.
Probably, it takes a lot of work to do that, at least not theoretically. And they've been sloppy with it. I think the way a Dostoevskian local priest in the community would have done it, if a Kierkegaard figure would have walked into the village and thought so highly of himself, he would probably point it out. Will you just get the fuck out of here? You know what we do here in the village with the role models that people need? We take dead people. That's what we've always done. That's exactly why scapegoats can be turned into gods too. But what we do is that we take dead people. We say, well, this guy was really great. He worked hard his entire life. He had tons of grandchildren. He was a great granddad, a great father figure. We can't think of anybody who spoke negatively against him in the entire community. And he died a few years ago, and we grieve him immensely. And we've decided that he was a saint. He was a lesser God. He's dead now, but we can go to his grave and talk to him, and he will talk to God on our behalf. And the great thing with corpses is that corpses cannot be changed. They are forever. They're timeless.
I just had an insight about Jordan Peterson, if you don't mind. It's like he's always talking about resentment, and perhaps resentment and irony are bound together. And
no, they're not.
If somebody is very ironic, like Kierkegaard with Diary of the Seducer.
I disagree. I disagree right away. Now, I see where you go. Sorry about interrupting, Andrew. But
I don't know if I'm right or not. You can disagree.
No, that was a wild guess, but you're wrong. No, I would say you cannot do that. You cannot put Kierkegaard or Heidegger among the resentment guys, because they're so close to Nietzsche that the fine nuances is here what you have to look at. And Nietzsche would have been at the same trap as these guys if the Overman was a universal ideal for human beings. But thank God it isn't. Nietzsche's Overman really is a savior figure. That's what I will insist on in your book. I'm saving Nietzsche, putting him there next to Judaism, Zoroastrianism, and Christianity. And I said, this guy has understood how fucking important the Messiah is. What Nietzsche tries to do is to sort of get to a pure essence of the Zoroastrian sociant, rather than trying to fit Christ into that thing afterwards, but rather say that, so what would it mean to take on the role of being a sociant, to be this autonomous leader? I think his mistake is to make it a single human being anyway, but at least Nietzsche never says that we should aspire to be an Overman ourselves.
I think that what Nietzsche was trying to get at, it's the Overman is somebody who is not swept away by the lure of the mob. It's somebody who dares to go against the opinion of what Heidegger called das Mann. That's kind of a nice expression. I got to give him that, right? It's somebody who doesn't really, it's not because people believe in this or it has to be like that the Overman just understands or just accepts it. So I don't think that an Overman is necessarily somebody who is leading or somebody who is powerful in a conventional sense. I mean, you can say like that Jesus Christ was an Overman, even though he was killed and tortured. But he never gave in to the mob. He never did that. And
Thomas, I think you're half right, but I think you missed the point here. The Savior is the leader. He's the only leader.
Okay, he only leads briefly. in a way that people not always think about a leader like that.
Well, he might be a leader with just one follower. I mean,
no, wait a second. You're missing the point. He is the only leader. We have no other leader. He's the only leader in history. That is why the Zoroastrians respect Christianity so well and think of Christianity as, they talk about the first Osha. He's the leader who possibly survives the whole thing, the whole ordeal. But the real leader only steps in temporarily to lead us out of the where we're stuck into the new. He's Moses. He's Zoroaster. Those are the Zoroastrian first Oshans. But they respect Christianity because Christ is the guy who should have led. He was the hyperject. He spoke up against the atrocities of the world, and he was killed by the mob. And because he was put on the cross, this is where Girard and Zoroastrianism agrees on Christ. Because he's put on the cross, at least the priest can point to him and say, this is what happens when you go pagan. This is Girard's point. And that's where Zoroastrians agree. That's why they respect Christianity. They don't fight Christianity.
You mean that this is what happens when you go pagan, that you become a mob and you kill somebody who should be killed? Oh, I agree.
Yeah. So the Zoroastrian take, this could have happened to Zoroaster, but we were lucky it didn't. But it could have happened to Zoroaster, but it happened with Christ and the Jews, and because they were out of the Persian Empire, going to the Roman Empire, situation was imperfect. And I'm sure Christ could have been a figure as well, where the Jews actually have the right to say that he was an obnoxious bastard or whatever. We will never know, probably. But if we use him afterwards as a narrative, it makes perfect sense to say that, okay, say this guy was an hyperject, and clearly the figure of the Gospels was an hyperjective figure. He spoke out against. He didn't work with the popularity at all, but he was the only real leader there is. This is the only leader. All other leaders that claim leadership are just bad mimicking. I
had a question about that, right? I have a question about that because in Christianity, Jesus says, I come here with the sword to tear apart families and all that kind of thing. And I think that's what the Jews have a problem with, because I think the Jews, for the Jews, the family is the center of the community, right? It's even more important than the synagogue.
You mean family's not important to Christianity? What are you talking about?
No, I mean that Jesus was. He says, I want to tear apart. I'm here. I don't
think you can use a single quote from Jesus in the Bible and say that this is what upset the Jews, because these quotes were all made up long after Christ lived.
Well, I mean, that Christ there's something about Christ that is sort of wanting to just kind of break apart the society, and whereas some of the other kind of leaders have a different quality of.
No, but you're almost right. You're almost right.
I know what the Girardian interpretation is of that. So the Girardian interpretation of that is that you normally appease your community by killing scapegoats. That's what you do. When there's tension in the community, then you pick some innocent, poor bastard or woman, and you kill that person. And what Jesus Christ said, well, I bring the sword, that means that mechanism has to go. You will not be able to pacify your communities anymore by killing innocent people. That means that you will have more conflict. And that's what we are seeing right now. We don't have any scapegoats anymore. There are no convincing scapegoats. There is nobody that everybody agrees on is guilty. That doesn't exist anymore. And that means that very easy mechanism to bring peace to community, we don't have that anymore. And that's why we live in the age of the sword, because we don't believe anymore that if we kill the homeless people, there's a conflict in our street, you don't go out and kill the homeless people, some homeless person, and say it was his fault, right? That was what people did 2,000 years ago or thousands of years ago.
But Thomas, they will. I'm sure they will.
They're going back to it.
Yes, because if they're symbolically doing it already, which is what women usually do. So say a female lynch mob is basically somebody you go after and bully somebody, so they're so destroyed psychologically they will never return to the party, never show up again. That's symbolic destruction. That's happening already. It's called deplatforming in cancel culture. Next is just moving from symbolic to the real power of that, and the real lynch mob kills you literally. But I want to go back to the difference here is that I think if you look at the map of the Middle East, you think of the Persian Empire and how it fostered the Jewish nation. Well, the Jewish nation became the first nation that was both a religion and a nation at the same time. There is no separation between church and state in that system. Okay? The problem was that Christ claimed that he wanted to take Judaism universal. The Christians widely claimed that. That's not even
Paul, not Christ, actually, but anyway.
No, all of them did. Every one of them did. The apostles did. St. Peter did. And they all did. So Christianity was supposed to take the benefits of Judaism and respect Judaism and take it universal. And he was stopped from doing that. And there could be a very good political reason for that, which is likely, like Caiaphas said, we're going to kill this guy, because I'm sure they killed every guy. The Jews had gone from the Persian Empire to the Roman Empire. And the Jewish nation was incredibly powerful and popular in the Roman Empire. It was one of the most benefited provinces in the Cairo Empire. They had their own local king, and they were very wealthy, and they were doing well. The Hebrews and the Phoenicians were, of course, highly respected by the Romans, almost on par with the Greeks and the Egyptians. This was like the eastern part of the Roman Empire was where everything prospered. So they were at the center of the Roman Empire. And of course, if these guys have sort of set in and said that the Jewish nation, again, is within an empire, but as a nation, it is a religion nation at the same time. Now, if there were several messiahs running around, Jewish guys running around claiming that they would then conquer the entire Roman Empire with the wonderful ideas. Christ at least said he would do it through peaceful methods, and then he would, of course, eventually have to separate church and state. Because state would take care of violence and church would take care of peace, right? That is essentially very Christian idea. That's exactly what happened. And I think it was the Jews saw their interest that this would be very problematic. And I think it did. I think that's exactly what happened. The whole Jewish nation fell apart. We have Mossad and everything. We have the whole diaspora. And I think Jews rightly, until today, blame the Christians for having fucked up their good relationship with the Roman Empire, causing the diaspora, and causing Jews to be shattered around the world. That is why Jews today, without any sort of guilt, demand of the Europeans and demand of Christian nations around the world to then take responsibility for the fact that they need an exodus back to their promised land again and settle there. And they don't understand why they can't do that, since the Europeans have conquered 3 continents prior to them and done exactly the same thing, including truly slaughtering people on a massive scale. So I think defending a Jewish position here, I think this is interesting. I'm not taking sides. I'm just saying that Christianity claimed to be universal religion. But I think if you're going to be universal religion, you can only be an imperial religion. You cannot be universal religion per se, because then you try to make church and state totally opposite things. And then you got to get a state that is completely secular, but no longer is run by religion. And then you get the kind of problems.
Well, one thing that people don't know is that Jesus said, don't let the Gentiles in. He was a rabbi, like he was from the Hebrew tradition. He was a, and then later on, Paul decided that to let everybody in. It wasn't actually Jesus who was the one who.
I think this is all a bit. I mean, there are many. I mean, if you say
it's just another theory, I guess.
If you say Christianity, the question is, what do you mean by that, right? I mean, there's like Protestantism, Calvinism, there's Orthodox Christianity, Catholicism. Then there's the older forms of Christianity and stuff like that. And then there's also like this basically this text that took the world by storm, right? With this story. Now, I'm interested in this story. I'm interested in, well, why is this story valuable now? And there's a lot of people who took all kinds of nonsense out of this story, right? I mean, you have to believe in this, or your soul goes to heaven after death and stuff like that. I'm not interested in this at all. But this story that exposes the mob, the tendency to form mobs and to kill scapegoats, that's the core of Christianity.
It's not just Christianity, though. It's a build-up from Judaism because everything in the Old Testament
are present in Judaism. I think that Christianity is basically a continuation of Judaism, and it's an examination of the problem of mobs. That's it. And all the rest is just decoration and liturgy and fantasies, and we go to heaven after death and stuff like that.
I agree that this is Judaism. This is the 10 Commandments, and the 10 Commandments obviously arrived to get the scapegoating out of the system.
Because you don't. It's so the 10 Commandments are basically designed to stop people from developing mimetic desire that leads to rivalry, that leads to mobs, that leads to killing of scapegoats. And then there's in the Old Testament, there's something, I think, the servant of Yahweh or something like that. That is basically a very, very similar story to the crucifixion of Christ. And it's again a story that warns about mobs. And that's what's so incredibly valuable about these religions. That's why they can be still relevant if you strip away all the nonsense. So in a sense, just to return back to our conversation of, 45 minutes ago or something like that about Christianity, right? I think that one way of looking at the current conflict, the conflict with woke and QAnon and stuff like that, that's the ongoing Reformation contra Reformation. I mean, I'm studying theological text with a Calvinist minister in Holland, and he just said like, well, you know, I have the feeling that in the history books in the future there will be this line, right? The Catholic Protestant Reformation, Contra Reformation, 1500-2500. That we're still in the middle of the breakdown of Christianity. Because all of our morality is Christian morality. I mean, the woke mobs are Christian mobs. They just don't know they're Christians.
I think they're even more pagan than they're Christian because they're unforgiving.
They're a strange combination, like the obsession with protecting the victim, that's Christianity. And then, of course, the total lack of forgiveness and the formation of the mobs, that's pure paganism. So we got these weird mixtures of Christianity, the worst of Christianity with the worst of paganism. It's terrible.
That's what you get when you have Christianity without leadership. That's what you get. It goes more pagan that way. Sinks down into paganism. I'm just going to add, right? Can I just add a detail here? I acknowledge what you said, Andrew, before. It is Paul, really, who is the church-state separation thing. It's just like keep to the emperor what belongs to the emperor and keep to the church what belongs to the church.
No, that's Jesus.
That's
he
Paul.
said, like, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. It's Paul who said, like, you know, we're going to take it beyond Judaism.
Paul brought it beyond Judaism.
It is ascribed to Christ afterwards by a gospel heavily influenced by Paul. But yes, it's correct. It's been credited to Christ. But I think it is Paulinist. And of course, the church becomes Paulinist.
Okay, a question for you, Alexander. So separation of church and state, you often kind of seem to imply that you want to have these two things together. I kind of like, why would, I mean, can you explain that a bit? It sounds like a very bad idea. I mean,
no, it's not a bad idea at all. I think we've gone wrong and we have the current predicament because we believe we can live outside of religion. The first sentence in the Syntheism book by Jan Söderqvist is everything is religion and anything that pretends it's not religion is utterly dangerous. And the states and the markets of our capitalist society today be running about religion and they have their own rules in that case, but those rules don't have the ultimate horizon as, for example, the survival of the planet or anything that is actually meaningful in a sustainable way. We have to acknowledge the fact that we have created an incredibly exploitative culture that was completely unsustainable. That is a fact. And that is because state and market were not running under religion. They were running as if they could run their things in a secular way.
Well, what kind of religion would that be then? I mean, I wouldn't want to, you know, live in a state that was run by, I mean, what kind of religion would that be then? Is that something that happens in the far future?
No, the religions we're working on here, or the isms we're working on here, are called ecotopianism and cosmopolitanism. They make a lot of sense when you think about it. Ecotopianism is essentially the idea that there's this planet, there's nothing else. Forget about going anywhere else in space. And
I have a feeling that we need to distinguish between traditional religion and other kinds of religion.
No.
Like you can't just say everything is religion, then nothing is religion. Because
everything is religion, period. And if it tries to not be religion, that's when it gets dangerous, Andrew. That was my sentence, taking the whole sentence.
But there's
precisely,
a difference between traditional religion
and
making up religions like Syntheism and, I mean, I'm just...
Capitalism is a religion. Liberalism is a religion. Socialism is a religion. Nationalism is a religion. They're all religions.
Yeah, but they're all new kind of pseudo religions compared to the
they're religions,
big old religions.
Period.
Right?
They're religions. Mm-hmm. They're attempts at trying to control your mind through an ideology you must submit to. It's the whole.
Okay, I see.
But that's only one aspect of religion.
The alternative is anarchy, and when you just love anarchy and you love chaos, you love everybody killing everybody else. Then that becomes anarchism. It's just another religion. It's everywhere you look, you have a certain, the moment you wake up, the moment you start living, you got to have an idea of how the world operates. It's called a worldview.
Worldview, yeah.
And then out of the worldview, you start creating a certain subjectivity. Well, you create fantasies about other people having subjectivities, and finally you realize that the emptiness and the void inside of you has to be subjectivity too. But that is secondary. The number one thing is there's a worldview. And with the worldview comes the idea that this world operates in a certain way. You have to submit to how it operates. Otherwise, you're not going to get what you want.
So science is a new religion. You know, science is a religion, right? It's like...
No, scientism is a religion.
Scientism is a religion.
The idea that science is prior to anything else is a religious conviction. Science is just a practice. Farming is a practice, but agriculturalism becomes a religion. The idea that farming is more important than anything else, and it has to be done in a certain way, that becomes religion. These are religious practices. Religion is fundamentally practiced, right? But it's practiced out of an idea. And these ideas are always about containment. We're psychotic if we don't contain ourselves. So An obsessive religion, a fundamentalist religion, is an erotic response to the psychotic chaos of the world. What we try to do in any given society, we try to arrive somewhere in between, and we get a perverted guy called a priest, and we ask him to formulate an ideology for us. That's what a religion is. And that hopefully is not a pure ideology. It's built on practices and rituals and things that make meaning to us in everyday life. And the most basic things in life, like you're a child at a certain point, you're an adult at a certain point, parenthood means certain responsibilities, grandparenthood has a role there if you're lucky to live that long, we have elders and things like that. And we created tribe. And we called this the tribal poesis. And I'm coming to the point now, which I've talked a lot with Thomas about, I'm coming to the point that this tribal poesis, the beginning of the tribe, is the beginning of just about everything that means anything to human beings.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
And I don't think autopoiesis, you know, suddenly something self-organizes. I don't think self-organization exists either. I think if something organizes not in a collective way, not in an individual way, but in its truly tribal way, even in nature itself. And so do we human beings who are tribal social creatures. And we get our identity out of this tribal poetic event that occurs when we're born, for example. Now, once we understand that, then religion is, the word religare in French Latin means how you connect people one another. It's how you organize a society. That's what the word, it has nothing to do with gods or anything. It's just how you organize a society. That's what political ideologies should be referred to as religions and be held responsible for being religions that make religious claims.
Okay. So it's not that, so we should refer to these, yeah, like, I don't know, like you would say the Democratic Party is a religion. And they should think of themselves as being,
I think lazy bastards out there, when you say religion, say, well, I don't believe in God. Like, you have no clue what you're talking about. You go back to the fucking dictionary, take the word religion and learn what it means. It's nothing to do with God. That's theos. That's theology if we talk about that. Nothing to do with religion itself. Religious practices are everywhere. And when you study a specific society, a specific point in time, you will have to study what is the religious map? What is the ideological map like? Slavoj Žižek does this beautifully.
Well, I don't want to belabor this, but what's the difference between a Zoroastrian as a religion and, let's say, Syntheism, which is your proposed sort of...
No. Zoroastrianism is a really good alternative to start from. It's the best one I've found in history, because when Thomas asked me, so how do you have a religion of state? How do you have a religion of the market? How do you have a religion of the military? How do you have a religion of the priest? The Zoroastrians figured out that we actually need several religions that operate in parallel. The word for that is empire. Yeah. So the Latin word imperium originally has Persian origins, because the first imperium was Persian. The idea of the Persian Empire, the first Persian Empire, that was constructed by a priest called Zoroaster and a king called Vishtaspa, and started about 1700 before Christ at the peak of the Bronze Age. That was the first Persian Empire. And they were smart enough to install power sharing from day one. Now, if you're going to have power sharing, like, say, the American Constitution, because therefore you can have checks and balances within the system, which make it much more sustainable. The best way to do that is to different ideologies for the different poles of power. So you need different religions. Okay, good. Because then we can understand why monotheism exists in parallel with polytheism, because polytheism is essentially folk religion. Do we really care about what people practice in the villages? No, we care that the villages work. Do we care what people practice in the small towns around here? No, we don't really care about that, because we care that it works. Once the systems get more complicated and several towns become more important to one another and become trading posts along a long trade route, that whole trade route needs laws and needs rules to work, because otherwise it implodes. That is religion. And Judaism then complements Zoroastrianism by being the ultimate religion of the law. In Judaism, the law itself is the religion. It's God itself. But the Zoroastrians say, okay, for a nation, for people who speak the same language, who are within the same symbolic order, that would make sense. But you can't run an empire because everybody doesn't speak the same language at all within an empire. But you can have a court language that the priests speak and the military speak and people speak on a leadership level. And that remained the Persian language, by the way, in the entire Middle East, all the way from Greece to India, until English took over that role with the British Empire. But for thousands of years, people spoke Persian at the courts, all over the Middle East and Central Asia, and along the entire Silk Route, because it was the language that tied the Silk Route together. That's why you had a trade route to begin with. So even the Venetians had to learn Persian to speak with the people they traded with. Now, that's the court language. Then you can have local languages. People can speak whatever they like in the villages because they're just going to have a priest who reads from a book somewhere that's handwritten, and then they're going to follow the rules in that book. And that is just locally practiced religion. And the Zoroastrians thought that was fantastic. And they gave that name. That's what we call iconology now, polytheism, right? But monotheism, the two different monotheisms, there's either the military monotheism, which essentially it's Mithras killing the bull. It's the hero slaying the dragon. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's what guys look up to because they want to be the chief, right? And then you got the priest religion, which is the ultimate search for the truth, no matter how brutal and hard that truth is. Mm-hmm. And anybody goes like you guys have done Vajrayana Buddhism goes into deep spiritual practice, or Zoroastrianism, you go into deep practice, or Taoism, you go into deep practice, or in Judaism, you go towards the ultimate truth. And in a way, Girard is trying to defend some kind of tradition within Christianity for exactly that. Like, what if you go for the ultimate truth? And that is way more important than the end of the formal ideas of your religion.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. Yeah, I agree with that.
So that system was called Mithraism, Zoroastrianism, and folk Zoroastrianism. So when the Zoroastrian Persian Empire invaded Babylon, the most radical thing in human history happened. This is the 6th century before Christ. Prior to that, the Assyrians had invaded Babylon, and the Assyrians gladly boiled the kids of the Babylonians in oil, like people had done until then. Oh, we won the war. We're going to torture like mad. We're going to be like an organized lynch mob that knows no limit to the amount of torture and pain we can cause on you because we won and we have the right to do this and we enjoy it. That's what the Assyrians did to the Babylonians. And that was usually what was expected from one empire in the Middle East conquering the other one. What happened in the 6th century was that the Persians invaded the Babylonians, and Cyrus the Great walked straight to the temple of Marduk, the leading Babylonian god, and kissed the feet of Marduk. Mm-hmm. It was, I would claim, the most radical act ever in human history. And if I'm an eventologist, that's the act that sets everything. It changed everything in human history. What the Persians have realized was, learning from the Assyrians, that if we don't boil the Babylonian kids in oil, but we actually shock them and say that we're going to keep your king. We're going to hire him to be the local king for this specific nation, where you guys speak the same language, and then we're going to teach you to trade with the other nations within a larger empire that we're creating, because we have a religion that says this is the way we do things. We just have different levels of things. It worked wonders. After that, Babylon became the capital of the Persian Empire itself until they built Persepolis as a symbolic capital. But they had no reason not to turn it into the capital, and they were welcomed by the Babylonians. And this was, of course, the strength of the Persian Empire that lasted for 2,200 years. Then the other example was the Egyptian attempt at an empire, which happened about 400 years later, mimicking the Persians, very Girardian, which was Akhenaten. But probably because they only had one river, they created an empire that tried to be as efficient as the Persian Empire, but be as blood-soaked and tyrannical as the Syrians had been before them. They didn't understand why the Persians were kind people. It lasted for 6 years. It created enormous havoc in Egypt, and Egypt never, ever became the same place again after that. The Egyptian golden era was over. And I think this somehow, as Freud agrees with me, is the starting point for Judaism. Like the failure of the Akhenaten cult led to different interpretation of monotheism as a new paradigm to be practiced.
Oh, cool.
That became, Freud agrees with me, this became the cult that probably had the death of Tutankhamun as a starting point. Again, a perfect scapegoat to turn into your own starting point. They became like a new elite that then decided we're Hebrews and we're slaves under the old order, but we should be masters because we're really superior to anything else in this country called Egypt. So they left Egypt, and this is the starting point of Judaism.
Yeah. So,
and if you look at Judaism, they split the phallus. This is what the Zoroastrians understood. What Zoroaster understood was a genius, is that within monotheism itself, God has to be split, at least in two. Mm-hmm. It has to be split between the chief and the priest. And this in Judaism is, of course, Adonai that they took from the Egyptians, and who was the sun god of Egypt. Aten became Adonai. And then they took Java, who was the Vulcan god of the Philistines, and added him to that religion, of the Canaanites, not into religion. And when they eventually, the Jews connected with the Persians, and they're very popular in Babylon, and the Persians loved the Jews, and the sort of old sort of Persian Hebrew unity that created the West, which is the origin of the West, the origin of Greek philosophy and everything else that came afterwards. This Persian Hebrew unity starts with the idea that empire and nation can work together. And they are the only forms of social organization we know that's bigger than tribe, that has at least worked for periods of time. And if we don't,
and that came from kissing the feet of the nation or the whatever
of the enemy's God's feet.
Of the enemy's God's feet.
Yeah.
That's very, very interesting. Yeah.
And that opens up that your son can marry the enemy's daughter, right? And Dan Carlin and these guys are doing wonderful work on YouTube right now, popularizing ancient history, and they do really well. Dan Carlin's excellent exposés for hours talking about the Zoroastrian Empire and the Persians and why they were so radically different from anything we've seen before. And why this is, of course, the idea of forgiveness and kindness that we later see in Christianity has its origins here as well. This was an amazing historical event. And Christianity honors it in its own mythology. The Zoroastrian Magis came to honor Christ when he was born.
Oh, right. The three wise men were that's the three wise men were Persian.
They came from the east. What was east of the Hebrew nation? The Persian Empire. It was directly east of it. Of course, they were kings. Magis, they were kings who came from the Zoroastrian Empire.
Magis, yeah.
So there's never been a real conflict in that sense. There was a conflict in Zoroastrianism and Christianity for power reasons, because there was a conflict between the Persians and Byzants, which was tragic, by the way. It actually opened up for the Islamic invasion of the 6th century. Terrible mistake when you think of this historically speaking. Should hopefully never happened, but it did. So, but then Protestants and Catholics have been at war with each other again and again and again in Europe.
Yeah, like
it is very Girard. It's kind of novel again. He's just like the people who are the closest to one another often turn out to be the very worst and most violent enemies. This is constantly repeated in history.
Yeah, it's because you're similar, so you want the same object, so you become rivals, and then you start killing each other. That's the paradox.
Yeah.
So it's actually, I mean, it seems that humans have some very simple principles underlying their behavior.
Hey, I mean, the people who blocked Portland, Oregon for like several months are probably very closely related to the people who then stormed the Congress on January the 6th. Yeah, and both parties kind of one act was great and one act was
each other like crazy.
They mimic each other, yes.
So when Trump got elected, then it was a conspiracy. The elections were rigged. It was Putin. It was Facebook. And then, that was all over the news. And then Biden got elected, and it's the same thing, It's a conspiracy, the elections are rigged and this and that. I mean, it's exactly this. It's almost comical, and people don't seem to understand that exactly, that people keep on talking about these superficial differences, and they don't see the underlying mechanisms that are like completely the same. It's quite hilarious, actually.
No. Can I go back to that dyad triad thing, Thomas? Because I'm really on fire about it. So with Girard, he introduced a model and their subject and their object. Maybe you could repeat how that actually works. And can we then go into the dyads as well? Because obviously what you're hinting at here is that according to Girard, as long as the triad is there, it works. It's the same thing with Hegel. As long as there's project uniting subject and object, then the division between subject and object makes no sense at all. It's just a smooth process that works, right?
The triad works great. I mean,
triads work. The three of us personify that. Triads, good thing. Triads work, right?
Trialogues work,
Yeah, three zooms, right?
Three zooms work.
But the problem here is dyads. So if you look at those dyads, I would say there must be a subject model dyad. There must be a model object dyad, but there must also be a sort of vulgar Kantian subject object dyad. And where do things go wrong? Would you dare to define these dyads when one of the three parts are lacking?
Well, one of my favorite example is how Girard explains sadomasochism. So what's going on with that? I mean, why do people, sadomasochism, like, theatrical sadomasochism, let's say as a sexual practice. So why do people do that? So you have somebody who kind of like, in charge, putting another person in a very submissive position, maybe hurting that people. And actually they're doing that consensually, right? So this is something that both people enjoy. So we're talking about consensual sadomasochism. What's going on there? Well, what Girard points out is that they create a situation where you have a model, which is the sadist, and you have a subject, but there is no object. There's no object. The object is implicit because there is somebody because there is a model and a subject, there is an implied object. Because if you want an object, typically if it's a valuable object, you have rival. If it's a valuable object, you will go into rivalry with somebody, right? So you can turn it around. So instead of like first wanting the object and then the rivalry follows, you can actually create a rivalry, because if you have that rivalry, there must be some precious object somewhere. That's basically the thing that's going on. So you create a rivalry because you assume that if there is a rivalry, there must be some really valuable objects. So
what about that to Martin Heidegger, Adolf Hitler, and the Nazi flag? It's just like, that sounds like sadomasochism, if anything, to me, between the two of them, right?
Yeah, but that's kind of, I think, so if you have like, so you have three possibilities, right? If you go from triads that are potentially constructive, right, to dyads, well, they're also potentially constructive, but they're different, right? So you have so I just explained the model subject dyad. So let's say that you have, what is a model object dyad then? Well, I would say that's kind of that would be the anoject, that would be the tyrant, right? Because it's a model. Look at me, I'm a model for you subjects, and I have this object that you all want. You know, look at Hitler. He had the solution for Germany, right? So that's a model object dyad. I mean, this is just experimental, right? But I think
I appreciate that. I think it's fantastic. Yes.
So you have the model objects, and then of course you assume that there will be subject out there that will be attracted to that dyad that you created, right? So and then you have the third possibility, that's a subject object. So what would that be? Well, that would be like if you go directly to your drives, you directly start satisfying your drives. So that's addictions.
Yeah.
That's the subject object. So instead of finding a partner and having a relationship and a sexual relationship, you basically just take heroin or marijuana, because these are kind of hijacking your sexual reward systems. So you don't need, you basically, it's just you and that object. And of course, the model is kind of like the addiction is kind of serves as a model as well, right? Because you are subjected to that model. So that's basically, and I guess that would be these three forms. I think that's what's called perversion, because normally you have a triad, right? So you have model, subject, object. But if you have dyads, so that's basically, I think, what you could call perversion in a technical sense, right?
Because there's a shadow there. There's the missing.
No, perversion has to do with distancing, but I think it's relevant here. But just to put it with Andrew's question, perversion means basically you be distanced from something. So perversions could actually make you survive, for example, in an environment where everybody else goes neurotically obsessed with something or psychotically dissolved.
Oh.
A perversion is a capacity for you to act, and the neurotic and the psychotic are both useless. That's what psychoanalysis is very tough on you. It says that you only have the three options of neurotic, psychotic, and perverted. But we also use perverted is a neutral term in that sense, but perverted here means that the distancing here creates a certain creates a certain outcome, and this gets really interesting. This is a weakness in Hegel, because I don't see in Hegel that there is a philosophy in Hegel on how to deal with projects when projects go wrong. It seems that the project is still active if the model is involved, for example.
But I think that Hegelian desire is dyadic. So Hegel says that what you desire is the desire of the others, but it's actually a triad in Girard, right? So you want what the other person wants.
Yeah, true. The other things are certainly aren't in Hegel, but since everything is on the move in Hegel and there's no solution in Hegel ever, there's just new negations, new voids that keep the whole thing going all the time. Actually, Hegel and Lacan are very similar here. But what they don't deal with the idea of a triad and what happens when the triad dissolves. What they deal with is, of course, that Kant gets stuck all the time. So they would agree with you that Kant gets stuck in what we would now call a very addictive mode. Pure dark, like
so. I'm kind of following you. I'm not. There's part that I'm not understanding. I guess there's a kind of healthy triad, and then there's a pathological triad or something like that.
Yeah, certainly.
And the healthy triad is the project. Is that?
I would not say healthy. I would say productive.
Productive. Okay. Well, useful, not destructive. And
you actually. I mean, I think that this is a flaw in Lacan, that he doesn't dare to speak about health. I think this
That's
is
a good one.
I think that there is something like
I get that from Zizek too. I kind of get that from all the French. All the French postmodernism. They don't like to talk about
very destructive ways of being, and there are ways of being that are much more together, that are much more healthy. So neurotics are basically, we're all neurotics, right? But what neurosis means for Lacan, for Girard, is basically that so you pick up all these desires from around you, right? So you pick up this desire there and that desire there, and then there will be desires that are conflicting, right? And so you for example, you're a conservative preacher, right? Christian preacher, and you want to have sex with men in public toilets. That's a neurosis, because you cannot unite these desires in one self of desire, because that's what the self is. It's the collection of desires that we have. That's what Girard says, and Gurlian, his pupil. So we are a self of desire. So we are our desires, and we are the deeds that we do to fulfill these desires. And so neurotic basically is somebody who kind of has two modes. And so you have one general mode where most of the desires are united, and then you have a mode where the other desires are suddenly to the forefront, which are incompatible with the first ones. And a neurotic knows, in the sense that there is a small part of him that's not, or her, that's not integrated. So it's kind of seen as an external part of the self. So in a hysteric neurotic will manifest these weird desires in the body. So you might have, neurotic blindness, for example. And then a psychotic is actually somebody who's also, so there is no strong self of desire. So that means that sometimes the other desires can take over, and they are not seen as external. So that's why you have this, this famous image of somebody who pretends to be Napoleon, right? So that's basically, if you have a fragile sense of self, you come into contact with Napoleon, you desire what Napoleon desires, and then you just become Napoleon. So that's the psychotic stance, where your self of desire is so fragmented that there's no center. And then you have the borderliners that are kind of in between the two, right?
Yep, makes a lot of sense. And this is why health is not there in the picture. Is also a reason why there's no division Tantra and Sutra in Lacanian's analysis, and he doesn't dare to mention transcendence as a drive in itself.
Yep, exactly.
So you could just simply argue that Lacan doesn't have a theory of what happens to a patient he's been successful with. Then why the hell does he open a clinic in the first place?
Yeah,
but that's
because Tantra is ecstatic. It's very positive on some level. It's very tough on another, but it's not.
Well, it's the alignment of desire, right?
Yeah.
So it's away from the neurotic stance. So it's like making sure that you don't have these neurotic islands that are not integrated with the rest of the desires. You cannot be there all the time. That's impossible. But you can spend time there. So especially, for example, when you dance, when you do projects, when you interact with people, so you can be. This is basically what Heidegger and Kierkegaard were going after when they were talking about authenticity, which was a really big deal in the beginning of the 20th century, right? And then also with the existentialists. So that's basically the goal of Tantra. It's a unity of desire. And then the Sutric stance is, of course, acknowledging that you are neurotic. So you will have that split. And there you need the law, right? You need a law that you follow. You need to do.
Yeah, you have to work with your neurosis.
Purification. And you understand that you have this split. I mean, there are certain desires that are incompatible with your other desires, and that's where you need sutra.
Yeah.
So the word we use here is transcendence, because without transcendence you cannot unify them, and that's where you end up with this sort of Lacanian.
Yeah, but the Lacanian Zizekian sort of cesspool, right, is that you don't go to the next step, right? You remain within this constant negation, or I mean, that's my feeling.
The negation of the negation of the negation.
Yeah, it doesn't. You don't get to the next step somehow.
No, but the thing is, this is what I brought up Zoroastrianism here, because, and this is obviously where it's totally related to Tantra. Zoroastrianism is a practice every morning.
Yeah.
Every day is a new day.
And it's a kind of a positive practice, right? There's a positivity.
No, it is there every day, because you cannot stay there. You can only occasionally stay or be within the level that we would now call the transcendent level here, when these desires are aligned, right? Mm-hmm. You can be there at least temporarily, but when you are there temporarily, you can do tons of shit. You can certainly get a view of the world from there. can then apply when you're not in that state any longer. You can do all kinds of things with that. And this is something that's lacking in psychoanalysis. It doesn't really believe in these things. It's still with Lacan got stuck in the sort of post-Christian idea of itself as a secular science. This was Freud's and Lacan's conviction, both of them. Yeah. And I don't think they could have stayed there. And I think Girard makes that turn in his work, is that, no, you couldn't stay there at all. The second you move into tribal poesis, the second you move into understanding human beings, tribal creatures, the second you got to leave psychoanalysis and create proper socioanalysis. When you do that, then all of a sudden you've got to take all these things into perspective. So, for example, the Hegelian project, it's not your personal project at all. Project is a tribal thing, and out of that projectivity, there can be certain subjectivities created. They create a tribal subject together when they're together. It's the only subjectivity that makes any sense. Anything else is just be like, yeah, I'm isolated here in my little hole. And you get like a vulgar man sitting there staring at an object you have no access to forever in a frozen framework. And it's just like, but that's not life. That's not how things operate. Yeah. Hegel's frustration with that was basically that, well, to begin with, this moves and it changes. So everything is changing all the time. Flux is introduced, process philosophy comes back to the West the big way with Hegel. And once that happens, then you got to understand these things. And then temporary states of being are ultimately the goals of any spiritual exercise that you perform. Yeah. And this is why I say that the leader, when I say this, almost aggressive, that the savior is the only leader. The Sociant is the only leader. All other leaders are at best bad mimickers of the Sociant. And when I say this, is that it's only a temporary state that anybody could ever be Sociant, or a group of people can have a Sociantic function or messianic function. We're looking for that today because we're looking for some people to step forward and create something that is so fantastic, that covers all the different aspects of what society is today, that they could unify a certain group of people who can then become role models for people to look up to.
So that's the best hope. Is that the explanation that everybody's throwing so much money to people like Elon Musk?
Well, he's the infantile version of that, but that's better than nothing, and it's not a fake phallus. But yeah, I think this is what I talk about when I talk about ecotopianism. So ecotopianism is ultimately the horizon is the planet. Everything we do must be sustainable. Now, why don't we then use our best asset, which is the innovation of technology and creating events throughout history, and then try to create a series of events that actually accomplishes the ecotopian mission. Now, when you talk to environmentalists, they're dystopian. And engineers don't become environmentalists, and environmentalists don't become engineers, and you need engineers. So you talk about ecotopianism with engineers, and they're totally on fire.
Yeah. It occurs to me that environmentalism is sort of sutric, right? It's like, it's always obsessed with the problem and the sickness and the, and the neurosis. Whereas in Tantra, you move into a constructive, you move into you do things like feast practices, you do practices together, right?
Well, ecotopianism is certainly transcendent.
So it's a team, and it's not about your individual kind of angst and suffering. You're moving into another thing.
Yeah, but ecotopianism is certainly transcendent. We're not talking about utopianism anymore, but utopia is to be the opposite of dystopia. We will agree in our discussions to skip utopia and said that's a false dichotomy. There never was utopia versus dystopia. We talk about protopia. A protopia essentially is a society where you optimize things at any given time in any process. And the optimized shared value you get out of that, everybody could benefit from that. It's just what any engineer gets when he works every day with making something better than it used to be the day before. So that sort of these process of optimization, they need to be under a bigger contained, because otherwise they will still run under some kind of a rule of exploitation. And then it's optimization of the exploitative effort that pays off within the process. That's how you destroy a planet and you all go down. So it has to operate within the principle we call imploitation. Imploitation is essentially like, here, you've been given this value. You can have access to this. You can do whatever you like with it, as long as it's still there tomorrow.
Right. Yeah.
Now, that, for example, means that solar power, wind power are different from fossil fuels. We wrote about this in the Nanocrats 20 years ago. The principle of imploitation is the only principle that makes any sense in the long run. What we didn't write in that book is really a theological principle, to be honest about it. And the other major transcendental...
Maybe the theological principle is sort of tantric as well. I keep coming back to Tantra, but...
You use Tantra the way you use transcendence here.
Okay.
It's the same thing in that case. Yes, I would agree. But the really Sutra, I think Sutra first accomplishes to say that the dichotomy between utopia and dystopia is a false dichotomy. That's the end of Sutra. The Tantric is then, but what do we do then? Oh, we can go protopian. Brilliant idea, because since we realized this dichotomy was a false one, we can go for another one. You can do the same with determinism versus indeterminism. If you do natural sciences, you would discover that actually the world operates like a transdeterminist thing. The universe doesn't operate in a determinist, indeterminist manner because those are only local definitions, and actually the universe is global. So you can look at a lot of false dichotomies that way in philosophy, and it's a very Hegelian way to find out actually which dichotomies actually make sense and which are the ones we just get stuck with all the time because we haven't thought through them properly. Yeah, and I think transcendent thinking requires that.
There's a legacy of Kant with his dichotomies all the time, and
yeah,
it's very much it's either this or that, and you know, Heidegger basically continued that.
Yeah, so I would say. The other one here is cosmopolitanism. We talked about it before. It's the same thing, but just applied to social affairs instead. And I would say cosmopolitanism today, which means that you're supposed to love the stranger rather than kill the stranger, which is what priests aim to convince people to do. If we take cosmopolitanism seriously today, we cannot start with individualism as well. Again, the opposition between individual and collective, I think, is a false dichotomy. I don't think you operate either of those two ways. We're not collectivists and we're not individualists. We are very tribal creatures. We three created the tribe of three here. Anybody participates with us here in the dialogue here extends the tribe. But I think Thomas has a beautiful word for that. That could be the ideal we're looking for. Before we start with cosmopolitanism, which is how human beings should relate to one another, and ecotopianism, which are human beings or culture should relate to nature. Mm-hmm. Before we start exploring those two ideas fully, we need to go to a basic idea that unites all of these. And Thomas said the term embodied tribe. Mm-hmm. Doesn't that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What do you say, Andrew, about that? What comes to mind when you hear about an embodied tribe?
That's a work in progress. And of course, from my perspective, it's a Sangha or something like that, which is like, yes, it's like the community, like a community oriented towards positive projects, but also very odd kind of practices of experiencing all kinds of things. It's just an experiment. What you call a drawing board, I think that's a good way of looking at a correct or a good
I
Sangha.
agree. So you discover here that this is both shamanic and exotological at the same time. It's the shamans or shamanic characters out there, shamanoid people. I talked to Jamie Will today again, but he's a burner like me. If you go to Burning Man, that's been a place of great inspiration for people to think properly today. The thing is this, that the embodied tribe to me starts with somebody living in the new way that is possible in the new times that we live. Mm-hmm. So it's the embodiment of tribal poesis. And these guys got it. They created what we call a subculture today or tribal community today that through their experimentation and their openness and their creativity and their sound values, in general.
Maybe they're lacking the hyperject, however. Maybe that's missing from their whole project. I'm not sure.
No, I think an embodied tribe will be attacked. Yeah. Certainly. That's the Red Sea you talked about. That's when the old paradigm comes after you.
Yeah.
Because they want to control you and they want to kill you because you're that radical and new. Yeah. And that's where they go after you. You're creating the new communitas. You're creating the new congregation. This is what Zoroastrianism, Judaism, Christianity, even Islam, they all share this. This is the best part of religion, is that somebody has to be first and do the embodied tribe thing. But the embodied tribe can be mimicked. And it's exactly the point. It's a role model for other people to live the same way. And the day everybody in the embodied tribe are dead, we can all turn them into lesser gods, and then we can call them saints, and we can go and talk to them, and they can talk to God on our behalf. And we created a caste. Mm-hmm. But, as long as that paradigm lasts, that caste is probably the best way we can organize human beings.
So, and then there are the other ways of, let's say, less desirable ways to making tribes, which is like pagan tribes, based on the abject and scapegoating.
I have a question, because I was thinking about John Vervaeke, and I was thinking about how he keeps quoting Thich Nhat Hanh, who says like the next Buddha is the Sangha, and I don't like that because
he stole that from Trungpa.
Was it Trump who said that? I thought it was Thich Nhat Hanh. Anyway,
I think
maybe that's true.
Why don't you Buddhists sort that out? I'd be thrilled to hear the
No, hold on,
but
I think you need all three.
What does it mean?
I think you need all three. I think you.
No, you got to explain the term you just used. You
okay. Buddha is the Buddha, the Buddha, and then Dharma is the teaching, and Sangha is the community. Those three things. And you have to have all those three things. It's just obvious to me, but.
So the Buddha is then the hyperject here.
The Buddha is the hyperject, exactly.
Yeah, and the Dharma is the what I call religion. That's the set of practices and principles and ideology that unites the community. Exactly. And then the Sangha is the beauty of it all. That is the embodied tribe.
Exactly. There you go. Yeah.
And out of that comes children who are born into this community. And of course, they would then experience a tribal poetic awakening, which means that they will see a mother figure they'll be united with for a while yet, sucking her tit, and then they'll see a father figure or a phallus, and then they'll be turning between the two for a while. They have a childhood, and in that process, they're non-mother, non-father. Wow! They're scared like shit. They're non-father, non-mother at the same time. There's something else entirely. That is the beginning of subjectivity, correctly in Lacanian's analysis. But did you please note that this was like the third subject involved in the process rather than the first one? At least third. Probably there was some matriarch who received them when they smiled to them when they were born and things. So there've been tons of people around this specific little kid's body before the kid even has any sort of a subjective experience that's meaningful. So subjectivity comes out. It's a tribal subject we're talking about. It's a tribal poetic event that's happening. And to speak about human beings I haven't seen any other models about it. What I'm talking about in our work, Söderqvist and I, is just how do you possibly scale this up? And that takes effort, enormous effort, and it takes control, and it takes similarity to the tribal at all stages. But what Zoroaster successfully achieved, and he achieved a model that worked, was through power sharing and split religion and split follows and everything that's needed, you can create larger systems that actually work over time and can last for thousands of years. They're called empires and nations. And yeah, I mean, it's going to be fiendishly hard to create them. And if you can't have them, then let technology itself be the empire and let humanity resort to having small little tribal communities and cities that hopefully trade with each other instead of going to war with one another. That's probably the best we can hope for 50 years from now. I think we're moving into the Middle Ages again. Hopefully they're not dark.
Yeah, high Middle Ages. What was the similarity?
I think the empires are weak. We have today, really weak. I don't think this will stand the test of time. I think city-states are the best, small countries where people speak the same language, know their neighbors. I think if you go to Slovenia, you can, as any citizen, you can shake hands with the prime minister of the country and you wave the same flag and you have a sovereign territory. I think that's the future. I think Israel is the future in many ways. I think the Scandinavian countries are a model in that the larger countries should be split up in smaller units.
Yeah, small is beautiful.
Because I think technology can handle imperium. This is the thesis of the global empire for 2003. We wrote the book. We knew we were misunderstood. We knew nobody would understand why we wrote a book called The Global Empire when digital happened. But hey, we just stated what every computer scientist already knew out there, you know, like Mark Burgess and these guys these days. They would know that, yeah, the internet protocol is there and the internet is operating towards global imperial power. But that's what technology does.
So we have city-states embedded in a matrix of artificial intelligence, basically.
Something like that.
I think I would say that's hopefully the best thing we could hope. I think it's the best thing we could hope for today.
Yeah, I mean, there was this article by DeepMind and University of Oxford on taking what they called critical science and then incorporating that in AI. So that's kind of like an interesting direction, right?
Yeah, I hope the AIs compete with one another, though. That's why I'm a big proponent of power sharing before we go imperial, meaning that power splitting. So start with at least three centers of power.
Are basically, I bring this up because, I mean, like a company like DeepMind is one of the absolute leaders in AI and an Oxford University. They're basically examining how you take a certain ideology, namely critical theory, and how you basically incorporate these ideas into an AI that would supervise, let's say social media and this and that. So you would have a direct incorporation of ideology into AI. So these things are being examined right now by people who are very close to the centers of power.
Which means that if they make the mistake to go for one ideology, create one AI running with one ideology, that would be disastrous. I think we need to split up big tech very quickly.
Yes,
I think that's a really, really good start. I think the Republicans in America should be really grateful because they've been given a free hand. They've just basically given that, hey, here's the perfect object for you, big tech. Tear it apart, please. We'll all love you for it. You know.
But the problem is that Biden is going to be pulled apart by both parties, right? He's not woke enough for the woke people, and he's well, whatever. He's not enough for the other part, right? He's not Trump enough for the other party. So he's going to be stuck between the hammer and the anvil, right?
No, not really, because there's a reason why the Republicans were held back by Trump, because he won the Republican nomination and he was a Republican president. So the problem for the woke people, saying Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in America today, she better keep her mouth a little shut now when Biden runs the show with Pelosi, because otherwise she's dead. Her career is over. That's the system within which she's making her career. And the grateful thing about things being run centrally is that the guys further down the hierarchy actually need to be within the system, be contained. It's also the benefit of the religious system. It is there to contain the young guys from not being too cocky. But the thing with the Republicans right now is that post-Trump, they're in opposition. And that means they've got tons of guys who are all fighting for leadership, which is to have the next presidential nomination in 4 years' time. It's also about winning local elections before that 2 years from now. And I think big tech, tearing big tech apart is such an open winner for them. It's they can use everything they can in whatever resources they have, including money from billionaires who hate big tech and things, to tear the system apart and tear it into smaller units. And I think the world would be better off if they do that.
So we're going to be shut down here after this conversation for sure. I think YouTube's just going to.
We're problematizing that. We're not saying they should do that.
That's the end of my YouTube channel.
Oh no, we're going to be hired as consultants.
Oh, maybe that or that. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's going to be interesting what China does, because I think in China already now, you had a dictator and you had another dictator. You had Xi Jinping, you had Jack Ma, and obviously Jack Ma had to retire. He left for 3 months, and Xi Jinping's guards went after him. They couldn't have such a powerful figure rising out of technology. So the Chinese have also realized that we cannot have big tech that is as powerful as America. If the Americans are naive about it, at least we will not be. So the Chinese have discovered that how the fuck do we do that? Because they politically have not installed any power sharing. They are Egyptians, they're not Persians. That is the problem. That's where they will start making the mistakes. And when we will have horror technologies trying to run large parts of our society and our life worlds, there will be Chinese technologies. This is the problem with the Chinese technologies. They just built Huawei because the Huawei was meant to be an Egyptian pyramid controlling the world for the Chinese. And we weren't impressed because we've seen pyramids before and they're symbols of death. They're not symbols of life.
Yeah.
So I'm a strong proponent.
Persian,
like all of this stuff
need to be Persian.
All of this stuff is running on chips, right?
I'm okay with that.
These chips are made in South Korea and in Taiwan.
Yeah, they are.
2 companies.
What chips? Sorry, what's
all the chips that run AI and stuff like that. I mean, it's made
microchips. Okay.
They're made in 2 companies. I mean, it's Samsung in South Korea and it's TMSC in Taiwan. And Taiwan is considered by China to be part of China. I mean,
it isn't.
Very interesting.
It isn't. Yeah, it's not. And if they would conquer Taiwan, the Taiwanese would leave and take the company with them, probably. Let's not go into that. It turns into everyday politics, but fantastic conversation.
Yeah. Well, there's like 5 minutes or so left if we're sticking with our time.
Also, you're like a Lutheran priest with a gun here who's got to kill us if we finish off a couple of minutes early.
I actually don't really care anymore, but I'm trying to let go of that. But
Andrew, I think this was wonderful. Everything I'd hoped for, it's all in there.
Yeah.
Would love feedback.
Yeah, and I'm on drugs too, so I did better than I thought I would.
Yeah.
I've got new medication now. So
good. And more on the perversions of the diets. That's something I want to look into further. Thomas' speculations much appreciated.
Of diets?
Of the dyads.
Dyads.
The dyads.
Okay.
Yeah.
The dyads and triads.
The perversions of the dyads. We can explore that further in the future.
I think we should talk more about perversion next time. That was like...
okay. Yeah.
I mean,
it's certainly tantric and sutric, you know.
Gourdian has done a lot. So he's a pupil of Girard. He's a French guy. He's still alive, and he's written basically he designed a whole kind of model of the mind based on Girardian triad. So he explains neurosis, psychosis. Also various forms of neurosis and psychosis, because the model can arise as a model. For example, a teacher, then a teacher is a proper model, right? But it can also be an obstacle. You know, I will never be as beautiful as that person, or will never be as rich as that person. Then you turn that model into an obstacle. And, you know, I'll never get that. And then you have a rival.
Ideal is an obstacle.
So you have a model that can be a rival, and you're constantly competing with somebody, and you think that you're capable of overhauling him. So there are three ways in which the model can arise. And so you have three types of neuroticism. You have three types of psychosis. So and you can understand all these weird ways that people behave based on this very simple idea of triangular desire, and it's incredibly parsimonious. It explains so much based on some very, very simple ideas. So, and I think this is basically what people like Freud and Jung and Lacan try to accomplish. And I think it's Girard who actually nailed it. I mean, I'm sure it's not perfect, but it explains a lot more than I get from reading other thinkers about human mind.
Isn't this obstacle thing here you talk about, isn't that the 2020s, when people have discovered that the internet's not going to give them the fame and the glory and whatever they thought it would give them? And this enormous disappointment we see now that is sort of pulling in these crowds, both on the woke side and the sort of new age fascist side on the other hand. I mean, they're both being pulling in these people who are deeply, deeply disappointed because they didn't get what they wanted. And then, of course, it's not that they're going to get it through these mass movements because they did not get it. It's really that there was an obstacle. And can you describe what that obstacle would do to them? The disappointment when they realize, I'm never going to have that.
Well, you get stuck, right? You go into this circle. You get obsessed by the obstacle. And
then you're vulnerable to practically anything, right? It's not something could just... You become you could be parasite. You could be, you could be involved in any kind of ideology or movement, or, just because you don't have any identity anymore. Does that make sense? Or you've kind of like crushed your.
Well, that is
future or past, and you become.
That is the same mentality of Nietzsche. Yeah, so it starts with resentment. The resentment here, if you add Girardian thinking to that, would start with actually there was something you aspired to and it failed completely, and you're convinced it's never going to happen to you, and you realize that's an obstacle in front of you. And the resentment regarding that obstacle means that you can, as a guilty pleasure, get obsessed with it because you didn't have it, but somebody else did.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so
then you would attack yourself, or you would attack somebody else.
Both. I think men in general attack themselves, and women attack others in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
It's called borderline diagnosis, but the only difference is that men attack what's inward, meaning themselves, and women attack outwards, and it's just the difference in hormones. Really, none of them is any better than the other. They just get very destructive. Yeah, lynch mob material. That's where we ended up tonight, isn't it?
Yeah,
guys.
No, and actually, I loved what you said about Persia, and I'm starting to warm to the idea that yes, what we need is the two river system in Persia, and
they had to
become Persian and not Egyptian.
It's a double two river system even. So it's just like India and China are too, by the way. There you go. But it's good to have two rivers because at least it creates some competition between the two rivers. Yeah. And a good land in between to build the temple.
And kind of dynamism and.
Well, I have Tom Holland on the menu. I'm going to read his book on the Persian Empire. I really liked his book about Christianity.
Dominion.
He's not very popular with the Persian historians, but why don't we go back to him? I'll check him out too. I will, absolutely. All right.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, guys. That was wonderful.
Thanks for tonight.
I didn't invite anybody. I'm just gonna, record and put it up on the YouTube channel, and
that's a good one
as usual.
Let's do that.
So Yeah, I guess we're talking soon, Alexander, or not that we're talking to what's that fellow's name?
Thomas discovered him with Paul, the fantastic Danish talent. We're
going to do a talk with Ellen next. Another crazy, I forget what, my brain is fried, I think, but where's he from, Ellen? He's from the same place as you, right? He's another Danish.
He's from Copenhagen. Yeah?
He's from another Copenhagen dude.
Alexander Ellung, right?
Yeah.
Alexander.
Exactly.
All right. Anyway, good night, everybody.
Big love to you both.
Lots of love.
Bye.
You're amazing.